Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I appreciate you investing your time each week, and I hope you'll find the content of the material that I bring out is helpful to you. Usually, the material that I cover on a Monday is sourced by problems or situations that crop up on a day-to-day basis, and that's what's happening today. I received a call from one of our agents this past week, and he said, I sold a property from sellers of mine, from clients of mine, and then I got a call from them, and it turns out that after it sold, a family member came along and said, what, you sold it? I wanted to buy it myself. And so Grandpa, the owner of the property, called me up and said, what's it going to cost me to get out of this deal? Well, that's an interesting question. And it's no simple answer. But it's one we need to understand because people do change their mind. Now, usually it's not the seller who changes their mind. Usually it's the buyer that changes their mind, but it can be either one. And I want to address both quickly with you today. Let's talk about buyers first of all. We use the expression buyer remorse. You know, they sign on the line and then they get thinking about it and stewing about it. And somebody tells them, why are you doing that? You paid too much. And they think about the finality of it and so on. And then they decide they want out. And often the agent is caught in the middle about what he's going to do about this particular thing. So we want to take a look at it when a buyer wants out of the deal. First of all, let's look at a conditional deal. If the buyer decides he wants out and it's conditional, it's pretty easy for the buyer to get out. Why do I say that? Because most conditions these days are really options of purchase. It usually says, whether it's a building inspection or whether it's financing, it usually says that the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. So the buyer can look at whatever. It used to be on financing, for example, the clause used to say along the lines of that the person qualifies for a mortgage of at least so much money and the interest rate not more than so much money amortized over such and such a period. And it was very specific. Now we just say satisfactory to the buyer. But even there's an obligation to show that the buyer is negotiating in good faith and not just changing his mind. I remember years ago, I had a fellow that I certainly qualified him, and he was an engineer, had a really good job. He was in his 50s, had never bought a house before, and he was very, very nervous. I brought him the right house. We put in an offer, put it together, conditional on financing, and a couple of days later, he called me up and said he wanted out. He wanted out because he changed his mind. He just got cold feet. And that's a very common phenomenon. That's why they have a cooling off period for new condominiums, and now they have a cooling off period for new home construction because they recognize people do change their mind. Well, the interesting thing with this is I had qualified this guy, and there's no way that he wouldn't qualify for a mortgage. I ran it by the seller, and the seller said, I don't believe he's bargaining in good faith. I think he's just changed his mind. I want proof that he couldn't get the financing. So I went back to the buyer. Next day, the buyer brings me a letter from the bank where the bank manager said he turned him down for the mortgage. Yeah, I called the bank manager. I said, I'm just curious. I qualified this guy. All day long, he's going to qualify for a mortgage. Why would you write this letter? He said, Wayne, I'm in the business of lending money. If I've got somebody that doesn't want to borrow any money, I'm not going to lend them the money. So he obviously wanted to keep an ongoing relationship with the consumer, in this case, the buyer. So he wrote him a letter. And that's how he got out of it. So, you know, if it's conditional on building inspection, they'll have to at least order a building inspection, or they're not operating in good faith. They're just changing their mind. What about if it's a firm transaction? Well, the first thing the buyer who wants out is going to look for is a loophole. He's going to look for a technical error. And he's going to look for, you know, did you give an information guide? Did you give a copy of the agreement of purchase and sale? Did you somehow screw up in your obligation? And that's one of the reasons why you got to be very, very careful to dot your I's and cross your T's. You don't want to have somebody walk away from a transaction because of somewhere where you fumbled the ball. So you want to be very careful about that. But there's also often underhanded ways people can get out of it. We had a situation not that long ago. We were selling a triplex, but it was actually a legal duplex with an illegal third apartment in the basement. I've talked to the city. Their attitude is that we are reactive, we're not proactive. We're not going out to try and shut down these things. We recognize them there, but if we get a complaint, we have to act on it. So the offer came in, it was accepted, became firm, and then the agent And the buyer, through his agent, said, we want you to redo the offer and show it as a single-family home. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's fraud. We said, no, we're not going to do that. So he said, fine, we're going to kill the deal. We want our deposit back. Well, you had a firm deal. Why would we give you the deposit back? But this is what the agent and the buyer dreamed up. They said, it's an illegal triplex. If you don't give us our deposit back in full, we're going to call the city and we're going to complain, and then we're going to shut one of the units down. So the seller thought, if I don't give them their deposit back, I can retain the deposit because of breach, but I'm going to lose the revenue from the third apartment. I'm going to lose the value of the property by selling it only on an income stream of 2 rather than 3. He gave them the deposit back. So they won. I wouldn't want to deal with his agent again, but he got away with it. Then the other option, when it's a firm deal, is to negotiate. And that's really where it falls down in most cases. The agent sits down, there are 2 agents sit down, the buyer and the seller, and say, look, these people, and it may be legitimate. The person entered into an agreement of purchase and sale, and a week later lost his job. Or maybe they were transferring in, the transfer got turned down. And all of a sudden they're in a position where they can't follow through with the sale. And so the seller may be reasonable about it, and they may be able to come to a compromise. And often the compromise is, well, if you give up your deposit, we'll let you out of the deal. And they may just let them out of the deal. It depends on how reasonable the parties are. And the deposit, back in the day when the deposits were $500 or $1,000, giving up the deposit was no hardship. Now if it's $30,000 or $40,000, you got some skin in the game. And that's one of the reasons why the deposits are so important. The next option is for the courts. And it's the path of last resort, really, because it's expensive. I was talking to a friend this past week who's involved in litigation. He was looking for a new lawyer. He got a recommendation. He found out when he called the lawyer, his fees were $1,000 an hour. Well, that gets pretty expensive if he's representing you for a day in court. I talked to another lawyer this week, sat down with him on another matter, and he told me he just finished a 3-day trial, and he said he was awarded $50,000 in fees. So you go to court, and they're battling over some money, and the only person who wins often is the lawyer. So we know that automatically, if the buyer is in breach, and we know the buyer is in breach, if it goes to court, the buyer is going to forfeit his deposit. It isn't damages. That's why the deposit is there. It's a sign of good faith. And so if he's not operating in good faith, he's forfeiting his deposit. And then they talk about damages. And there may or may not be damages, and sometimes they're tough to prove. If I'm going to buy a house and then I change my mind a week later, how much of a loss did the seller really sustain? He's got to prove it in court. What about when the seller wants out? Same thing happens. First, they're going to look for a technical loophole, something wrong in the agreement of purchase and sale that allows them to walk away from it. Then they're going to try and negotiate. If they can negotiate, so much the better. And then off to the courts. Bear in mind when they go in the courts, this time there's no deposit at play. It's the buyer who's ready, willing, and able to close who has the deposit. It's the seller who wants out. So when they go to court, and it's generally going to be the buyer who initiates the court action, he may sue for what we call specific performance. What he's saying is, no, I've covenanted to buy this property, I want to buy it. And generally speaking, it's been the norm. If it's a commercial or industrial transaction, the courts will look favorably at awarding specific performance. They'll force the seller to go through with the deal. But now we're seeing occasionally that happen with residential purchases. And the courts look at it in terms of the uniqueness of the property. If the buyer can just go ahead and buy another property and get basically what he was negotiating for here, the court said, well, he really hasn't lost anything. But if it's a very unique property or a very unique location, something that can't be replaced, the courts are saying, we understand that it's your home, but you covenanted to do this, and sometimes they're offering more and more a solution of specific performance. But anyway, regardless, anytime a buyer and seller decide, a buyer or seller decide they don't want to go through with the transaction, that's where your really negotiation skills come in, where you want to sit down with them and see if you can come up with a logical, reasonable resolution. Thanks so much for taking the time watching this video. I'll talk to you again next week.